Hello, my name is Kat Lambrecht. I'm a PhD student in rhetoric and composition at the University of Nevada, Reno. And today I am interviewing Dr. Ralph Cintron, associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And he works in both the English department and the Latin American and Latino study program. And he will be joining us in February as part of our symposium on rhetoric and political economy. It's titled Capitalism, Climate, and Public Discourse, The Limits and Possibilities of Rhetorical Intervention, and it will be February 12th at the University of Nevada, Reno. So in preparation for the symposium, we're hosting a series of interviews to familiarize participants with the work of scholars who are going to be attending the symposium. And it is in response to Naomi Klein's new book, This Changes Everything. She'll be giving a public lecture on the 11th, and then we're going to do the symposium on the 12th. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Cintron.
Sure, my pleasure.
So what I thought I'd start out with is just sort of a state of the field question. It strikes me that much of your work merges, reimagines, or expands the boundaries of rhetorical scholarship into territories that are traditionally associated with other fields. So given the expansion of rhetoric, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you anticipate our field evolving in the near future.
Are you referring to like ethnography and things of that sort? That's
Yes.
yeah, has expanded its scope and anticipating rhetoric. Well, that is a question, isn't it? I hate to make those sorts of grand visionary claims. So I have no idea how rhetoric is going to expand or change. I think that's a fantastically open-ended question. I think what I can do more or less is to provide some general complaints about where I think rhetoric is, and maybe suggest that, other directions are nice complements, to such things. There seems to be, in the way of complaint, I guess, there seems to be quite a wave of theorization, which is occurring particularly in post-humanist studies, which I'm very interested in. And quite a wave of theorization that I suppose with the linkage of post-humanist studies is linked up to kind of late work in postmodernism. I'm thinking of figures like Levinas and Derrida and so on and so on. Diane Davis's work, which I respect a great deal. But it also strikes me that those are very theoretical enterprises. And I don't know necessarily how we can ground such things in public discourses of the day, in events which are happening in the world, discourses which are not necessarily theoretically informed, but very much expressions of a kind of liberalism or liberal democracy or what have you. I'm thinking, of course, of the sort of ethnographic work that I do among activists. And it's interesting to me to see how they are a kind of a continuing expression of a kind of liberal democracy, but more from a progressive end of things. So it interests me how they conjure the world and continue to revalidate, perhaps unwittingly, a certain version of liberal democracy. But I also do, ethnographic work among conservative groups. They also continue to validate a certain kind of version of liberal democracy. Anyway, it seems that those discourses are the ones that are on the ground. And I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make. I don't know how those folks can swing over into the theoretical lenses that are kind of interesting rhetorical theorists of late. Say the post-humanist folks and so on, object-oriented ontology and so on and so on. I don't know how that stuff gravitates, for instance, towards more contemporary kinds of or on the ground kinds of discourses. So that's one of the reasons why I've always liked ethnographic work, because it says this seems to be what's here, what are its suppositions, what are its own theoretical views of things, how do people make sense of things. And it sometimes feels to me that the theoretical discourses are detached, perhaps unnecessarily so, perhaps unproductively so, from the sorts of things which are on the ground. So
Great.
I'm not going to say that necessarily rhetoric is going to head in those directions. I just think that that's one thing that ought to always be in place.
Perfect. So you talked a little bit about methodology and ethnography, and one of my favorite quotes from Angelstown was when you're describing ethnography and you say, rationality, the pure kind, does not exist outside the soup of human affairs. And I found that really compelling way to think about ethnographic work and how we situate ourselves when we do that sort of work. And so I was wondering if you had any advice for scholars who are interested in ethnography and trying to navigate that terrain.
Yes. Again, that is an interesting question. Ethnography, I think from the perspective that I've always practiced, is not logos-centered. It's not logocentric. It can never be so. It's barely a knowledge claim. It tries to understand what people are thinking about, and it tries to wrestle in some fashion or another. What groups are thinking about is the real, the correct, the moral. It tries to do all of that. But in the end, what it seems to be, it's about the relationships that an ethnographer creates with the people that they're talking to. So I think that particular conclusion was linked to another conclusion, that in the end, ethnographic work is always about the ethical relation between the ethnographer and the subjects who are speaking. So it seems to be ethical through and through. And in that sense, it seems to me it's the relationships that people create with the folks that one is talking to that actually generate and create the so-called knowledge. So if I have a different ethical relationship with someone else, or excuse me, there's another kind of ethnographer doing work with the same group of people that I am working with, and they create another ethical relationship of some sort, the knowledge is going to shift and change. So that's why rationality is always a part of the soup of human affairs. It's the soup of these, it's the ethical relations that one creates, that one is part of in time and place, you know, and so on. So making big claims about knowledge is a bit hard in terms of ethnographic work. It seems to be cross-cut much more by ethical relations, which itself is an interesting theoretical, you know, sort of issue, because again, thinking about so much of our theoretical work going on right now in rhetoric, it seems to be emphasizing, again, not the logocentric sorts of things, but the ethics of stuff. I'm thinking particularly, perhaps because I've been reading some of it lately in context with some other folks that here at UIC. Someone like Levinas, for instance, and his ethical concerns, you know, with the world. So anyway, that becomes kind of a linkage between maybe certain sorts of work going on in the theoretical terrain in rhetorical theory these days about the ethical, and certainly something which I said long time ago about ethnographic work being primarily of the ethical sort. I hope that's a good answer.
It is. I guess along those same lines, you talked about ethics as being something that our field is sort of turning to answer questions that we are curious about. So to turn a little bit towards the symposium, or to try to combine these two ideas, do you think that this same thread is coming into climate change debates at all in the United States, or should it, if we're going to make any progress?
Oh, that's another huge issue, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That's really worth thinking about. I would really look forward to that conversation. When we have the conference, that would be a fantastic conversation, I think. I don't know. I can say some maybe kind of superficial sorts of things, but maybe they set off some thoughts that may interest folks at the conference. Are all of those questions about sustainability, climate change, are those, there certainly is a knowledge component that's trying to work itself out. What's the speed at which glaciers melt, for instance? To what extent is seawater, rising? Those would be knowledge claims. But perhaps what we're looking for underneath all of those knowledge claims is a broad ethicality. So it raises questions about capitalism. And what is the ethicality underneath capitalism? That's a deep, deep question. Those on the left have often thought that there's a problem in ethicality with regards to, say, liberal democracy and capitalism. I think that statement, by the way, is incorrect. I think there is a strong ethicality, but it's an ethicality that the progressive left doesn't take too much account of. And people would simply say, well, self-interest cannot be ethical, for instance. Let's say that that's the core of a kind of liberal democracy. Self-interest is not ethical. I don't think that the early theorists of self-interest thought that they were being unethical. In fact, I think that they thought that this was the route to ethicality. But is self-interest, as we see it moving along further and further and further into modernity, is there a need for another kind of ethicality, or a need for a broader kind of ethicality? That seems to be the conviction of the left, and so self-interest doesn't seem to be sufficient, and so there's a struggle for perhaps a different model of ethicality. I think what I'm trying to articulate in some of the work that I'm working on right now, the book that I'm trying to finish, some essays that I've worked on, is a theorization of the commons. Is there an ethicality that underlies the commons, which is different from an ethicality that underlies self-interest? On the surface, people would say so. On the other hand, rather than dismissing an ethicality of self-interest and saying that there is only an ethicality in the commons, and so therefore self-interest ethicality is somehow or another flawed or wrong, again, I don't want to go there. I would rather articulate what those two ethicalities are, quite frankly, and how they function, and how both of them imagine themselves to be a kind of deep ethicality. But anyway, I think that maybe is the struggle. There's a struggle about an ethicality, maybe, regarding our relationships not only to ourselves, but to other beings, whatever those beings might be, material, immaterial. There's a sense of a kind of an ethicality with regards to perhaps the earth in some fashion or another. as the largest being that we know intimately? Anyway, I think that is a huge question. And I think in some ways that is precisely one way to think of a kind of current struggle which is going on in terms of trying to carve out a politics which somehow or another shifts away from merely a liberal democracy, merely a self-interestedness as it is embedded inside liberal democracy. I would even say even a rights discourse as it's embedded inside liberal democracy, towards a different version of an ethicality, towards a different version of rights maybe, towards a different version of justice, towards a different version of liberties and freedoms, towards all of those sorts of things. I think we're trying to define that politically, and we're trying to define that almost through a kind of philosophical ethics. So perhaps we live at a juncture. I don't know, ultimately. But sometimes it feels that way, in the same way that the 17th century was trying to carve out a juncture of a new ethical set of relations, new political set of relations. It might be that, for several decades, we have entered into another juncture in which a certain kind of exhaustion of a certain kind of version of ethicality in politics and so on has achieved a kind of exhaustion, as I think I've said before in print. And we're trying to figure out how does one jump out of this exhaustion into something which is a little different. I don't know. That's what it feels like. Exactly what those articulations are, I'm not really sure.
I suppose time will tell on that front. I guess another question I have, though I don't know if it's any, smaller in scope, maybe a little bit, but what do you suppose the role of rhetoric is in addressing these problems? So in the upcoming edited volume, Cultural Catastrophe and Rhetoric, you talk about how certain events are impacted in rhetorical ways and other events aren't. You talked a little bit about the melting of the ice sheets. Is there some role that we have to play or can play in helping those events get interpreted in different ways?
I think disciplinary questions about the role of rhetoric are not overly significant, to tell you the truth, because the discipline of rhetoric is not where these things are going to play themselves out. The rhetorics are going to shift, and they're already shifting. And whatever we do disciplinarily, I don't know if it's going to be the sort of agent of changing things. I think the body politic will find its own directions. And I think the discipline will simply, I hate to say it, but will watch and try to record and try to synthesize and try to analyze. On the other hand, this is something I've been thinking about. The theorists of our moment, and many of them will be rhetorical theorists, I hope that I might be one of them as these questions keep, coming and going. The theorists that are working in science studies, the theorists, I'm thinking of, in political theory, I'm thinking of, Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, Latour's. There's a bunch of anthropologists, Eduardo Cohn, how forests think. A variety of people that I've been looking at of late. I think all of these articulations may function in very powerful sorts of ways, but they may be a kind of poetics. And I think poetics is important, but poetics look strange sometimes to the body politic. I think Jane Bennett's work looks kind of strange to the body politic. But these poetics maybe are indications, maybe it's the first foray into trying to create these kinds of new ways of thinking about the political, new ways of thinking about the ethical. One of the arguments that I've been making of late is that John Locke's notion of property and labor theory, as it appears in the 17th century, in an odd way is a poetics, although we take it now as a kind of like a foundation for politics. But when you look at it and you think about just how deeply the notions that he was working with as he tries to articulate the notion of private property, the state of nature, as he articulates these bizarre constructions, as did Hobbes, about the savage. These were all poetics in a curious way. And then they eventually flow into political theory, standard political theory, in a curious way. So what might look like, maybe what might look like poetics at this particular moment is the formation of a kind of future which begins to take on more the appearance or the profile of new ways of thinking of political relations and ethical relations. So maybe it's poetics all the way through. Maybe it's poetics all the way down. And it's always been a poetics, simply because we can't ever name the thing itself as it is, the thing as such. We can never nail it down. All we can do is to be responding to our moment and our situation, and to be making claims about this is the way it is, or this is the way it ought to be. In other words, we're back to the knowledge claims. But since we can't ever quite grasp what that knowledge might be, perhaps we're just all kind of floundering in our poetics. So anyway, what difference does it make whether the rhetorical theorists amount to much more than a poetics? It doesn't make a difference. The discipline will try to work these things out. Political scientists will try to work it out. Political theorists will try to work it out. Anthropologists will try to work it out. Physicists, who seem to be doing some amazing work, will try to work it out. People involved in environmental studies will try to work it out. All of these versions will be poetics masquerading under knowledge. That's good enough, because that's what shapes the next stuff.
Okay, so thinking through the multiple fields that you just discussed. So we have poetics turning into political theory, and all different fields trying to respond to these things in different ways. What can be gained, or can there be anything gained, or how do we gain anything from doing interdisciplinary work?
Yeah, well, I think that's really terrific. I think my work has always been interdisciplinary. I'm working with a group right now at UIC, which is it's a group called Political Ecologies. It's a group of folks who are doing science studies, really coming out of biology. Folks in anthropology, folks in art, folks in political science, and so on. And then, of course, there's the group that I'm also involved in between rhetoric and economics, rhetoric and political economy. which some of the folks at Reno are also involved in. That's the only way I've been able to understand anything. And frankly, again, if I can, I guess I opened up with a complaint about rhetorical theory. Some rhetorical theorists want to play in a variety of interdisciplinary arenas. Others seem to be more placed in rhetorical theory, certain versions of philosophy, and so on. But I think the history of rhetoric has always been one without a specific discipline, right? I mean, that's how we've always defined it. I like that. I think that's good. I think we should play around with physicists. I think we should play. Right now, I'm playing around with mathematicians also. I should say that. That's amazing. Folks thinking about rhetoric from the perspective of mathematics. Mathematicians knowing full well that the symbol systems of math are rhetorical through and through. That's amazing. So within that group, we've been trying to think about potentiality. What's potentiality when we're thinking about rhetoric? What's potentiality when we're thinking about mathematical equations? What's potentiality when we're thinking about language? Agamben thought a lot about potentiality. Aristotle thought a lot about potentiality. Anyway, I love that stuff. And I fool around with lots of different pieces of it simply because my students get interested in it and I just kind of follow it. So whether it's math or whether it's science studies, whether it's economics, obviously political theory is important to me. Anthropology has always been important, and to a certain extent, I've always thought of myself perhaps even more as an anthropologist than as a rhetorical theorist. But all of those sorts of disciplines really do interest me a great deal, and I think we ought to be trying to, as rhetoricians, we ought to just really mix ourselves with as much of that as possible and just see what the hell begins to emerge, because we're just mixing ourselves with it.
All right. Well, on that note of potentiality and mixing and the field, I think those are all the questions that I have for you. I just wanted to thank you so much again for talking to me today. And we very much look forward to seeing you in February to talk more about these issues. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Do you want to, I don't know, maybe this is part of the interview or not the interview. Do you want to kind of give me a hint as to how you see this whole conference unfolding? So that I can figure out what the hell I'm supposed to be doing?
Sure. So there's a number of different answers, but I think that what we really wanted to do is find a common issue that would bring rhetoricians from all different types of fields and backgrounds together. So our goal with this conference is really to bring together multiple voices around a common issue and see what we can produce, think through together in order to work through these issues. So a lot of what you were just talking about in your last question about working together, bouncing ideas off each other, these sorts of things is really important to this conference. For that reason, we've invited graduate students, not only from rhetoric, but really all around our campus. Supporting this conference is political science, gender, race, and identity, journalism, and a number of other different departments on our campus. So we really want it to be interdisciplinary and conversations that start from rhetoric, but as you say, spill out to many other different disciplines. So that's one big goal of the conference.
I am really looking forward to it. And as you know, I'm kind of intersecting it with the course that I'm teaching. So I'm looking forward to looking at these interviews perhaps as part of that course, not beforehand, and so on and so on. Anyway, this really looks like a lot of fun. And how are things been with you?
Good. Just working on my comps, doing a lot of reading and writing, and budgeting for the symposium. So things are going well.
Okay. Well, thank you. I hope this was helpful. I honestly don't know. I always feel that in these interview situations, right, one starts opening one's mouth and really you have no idea where one's mouth goes. Your head just begins to follow your mouth.
It's productive. I think it'll be really, really useful. It really will be.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Ralph. I'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.